My name is Nikhil Goyal. I'm a sociologist. I'm finishing up my PhD at the University of Cambridge. I'm also the co-founder of the Young Progressives of Nassau County. Now, I just want to speak to you here. For a couple of minutes about the context for this issue and things that we can think about on where to apply more pressure on this administration. Now, my grandparents were refugees. They were displaced during the British partition of India. My grandfather lived in Lahore, which is current-day Pakistan, and he had to board a train from Lahore to India. And on that train, Hindus were coming out and they were being massacred in numbers. And he somehow arrived in India unharmed. My parents came to this country in the 1980s from India. And so I feel a particular sense of duty in fighting for that next generation that seeks refuge and sanctuary here in the United States. Now, my parents came in the 1980s. They came, I was born in this country. I'm able to stand before you here today because in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Hart-Celler Act of Immigration Act of 1965. And what that did was end racist nationality quotas that were implemented in 1924. And in 1924, people from non-Western Hemisphere and non-European countries were effectively barred from coming to the United States. Now that ended in the 1960s because civil rights protesters put their bodies on the line because they believed that racism was not acceptable, not just in our systems of housing and our schooling and public institutions. It was not acceptable in our immigration system as well. And so when we think about the struggle that we are facing today, we need to recognize, as Pat mentioned and as others, the political context of how we got to the place we are today. Now, the conditions that the Central American refugees and migrants and asylum seekers are fleeing are the very conditions that the United States, through its foreign policy, has contributed over the past 50 plus years. If you think about what happened in Guatemala, the CIA overthrew the democratically elected government in 1954. They also propped up a Guatemalan dictator in the 1980s, which engaged in a genocide of indigenous people. In Nicaragua, they funded the Contras, death squads that murdered hundreds and thousands of civilians. In Honduras, most recently, after the 2009 military coup of the democratically elected government of Manuel Zelaya, the US government immediately recognized the new right-wing government, and it has given Honduras more than $100 million in military aid and weapons since 2009. This is the same government that has engaged in the murder of thousands of indigenous activists, trade unionists, journalists, judges, and others. A woman named Berta Cáceres, an environmental activist, was murdered in Honduras several years ago. It is one of the worst places on earth to be an environmental activist. And so it is no coincidence that those individuals are fleeing violence and instability and trying to come here to the United States. It is a little bit rich for us as a country to deny refuge to the very people who are fleeing the violence that we created in the first place. And I tell the people who don't want undocumented people in this country, let's stop supporting right-wing death squads and overthrowing democratically elected governments in Central America, and then they won't be coming here to this country for stability. Now, I just want to also touch upon the political context of the current situation at the border. A couple of weeks ago, there was a bill to fund immigrant enforcement at the border. And there were two different bills, one in the House and one in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, introduced a bill that would provide humanitarian aid and much greater oversight over these immigrant detention centers. And then there was a Senate bill that was stripped of all these provisions for humanitarian aid. Guess what? The U.S. House voted the Mitch McConnell Republican Senate bill into law, including Democrats like Kathleen Rice and Tom Suozzi. Many of us were at Tom Suozzi's town hall earlier in the week, And he is part of a caucus called the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bipartisan caucus that effectively prevented Nancy Pelosi from putting the effective and necessary means to provide toothbrushes and basic hygiene products in these detention centers. And that's people will say, that's one vote. But if you look consistently, I'm a sociologist, we look at the facts, we look at the roll calls on the congressional websites, and you can see that they both voted to reauthorize ICE in the Department of Homeland Security Act in 2017. The very root cause of the family separation and immigrant detention. And last year, Representative Rice also voted for a bill that, quote, funded Trump's border wall and mass deportation force, according to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus opposed that bill because they viewed it as racist, as xenophobic, and un-American. And we should call our representatives, both our Democratic representatives and our Republican representatives, to stand in solidarity with our immigrant communities. Because it's not enough to simply talk the talk. You've got to walk the walk and take the necessary votes to protect them. And, I just want to read two quick quotes from representatives on that piece of legislation. Mark Pocan of Wisconsin said that, when did the Problem Solvers Caucus become the Child Abuse Caucus? Wouldn't they want to at least fight against contractors who run deplorable facilities? Kids are the ones who could lose today. Representative Pramila Jayapal said, I am looking for a new pharmaceutical drug that builds spines. Now, Democrats have very few options. We have a Republican-controlled Senate, and we have a Republican-controlled White House. We have very few options to stop these horrific practices. But our demands must be very clear and simple. Close the immigrant detention centers.
Yes.
Reunite the families and end all ICE deportation raids.
Yes.
When the Trump administration comes to Congress, and they will, for more money for immigrant enforcement, it is our job to tell our representatives to say clearly, not one more dollar for kids in cages.
Yes.
Not one more dollar for ICE deportation raids. Not one more dollar for family separation. Not one more dollar for human rights abuses. Our tax dollars should not be funding these very violations of basic American norms and rights. Woo. And I'll close with this. At this unprecedented time in American history, we are being tested as Americans, tested as human beings, tested as people who believe in humanity and justice. We are being tested in the same way Americans were tested when confronted with the horrors of slavery, with Jim Crow white supremacist terror, with Japanese internment camps, with the Nazi genocide of Jewish people, with violence against civil rights protesters, and most recently the Muslim ban and neo-Nazi violence in Charlottesville. The question I asked myself, and the question I believe many of you are asking yourselves, is when my children and grandchildren ask me what I did when immigrant children were being ripped out of the arms of their mothers and fathers, when children were being put into cages, when families were being destroyed from ICE, will I say that I engaged in life business as usual, or did I raise my voice and fight against this injustice? Did I put my body on the line to defend human rights and decency? So what will your answer be? Thank you. Woo!